As much as I like getting to play games that I know nothing about before working on that particular review, it can unfortunately be a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes it works out incredibly well, like in the case of Decap Attack, that I reviewed way back in episode 88, with Decap Attack turning out to definitely be what I would consider a bit of a hidden gem in the Genesis library. But then there's other times like last week when I reviewed Balljacks, a game where it turns out that there is a very good reason why it's somewhat obscure, because it's simply just not a very good game. With games like that, while I still like the process of learning something new, I'm not gonna lie, the research involved in playing that game wasn't exactly the most fun. But then there's another type of game where I'm actually pretty familiar with what I'm getting into when it comes time to review the game, but it's still not one that I've played before. So even though I don't have any questions about what I'm getting into, there's still at least a partially new experience going on when I boot up that specific game for the first time. That is the situation with this week's title, Spot Goes to Hollywood, specifically for the Sega Genesis. And I know, I've reviewed a lot of Genesis Mega Drive games recently, but trust me, things will be getting mixed up in the next few episodes. However, I should probably pause for a second, because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are wondering how exactly I managed to mention Decap Attack, Balljacks, and Spot Goes to Hollywood in the same intro. And to that, I'll say you were lucky, because I very easily could have pulled out Barbie Supermodel and The Great Waldo Search and basically made the same point. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I promise it will make sense if you stick with it for long enough, or your money back. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Spot Goes to Hollywood is a game that I've been curious about for a very long time. It was originally released fairly late in the Genesis lifespan, coming out in November of 1995 in both North America and Europe, just in time for Christmas season that year. Spot Goes to Hollywood was hard to miss when it was released, with advertisements in magazines and comic books, but beyond the advertising, the game got lots of coverage simply due to being the follow-up to Cool Spot, which had been a somewhat surprising multi-platform hit for Virgin Games in late 1993. And I want to be clear, when I say somewhat surprising there, I don't mean that Cool Spot was bad in any way. Quite the opposite. Both the Genesis and Master System versions of the game got 4 stars from me when I reviewed them in episodes 68 and 168 respectively. What I mean by somewhat surprising there is the fact that you could discuss a game based around a soft drink mascot as being in the running for Game of the Year that year legitimately. And it wasn't crazy. The game was that good. I mean, just think if someone told you that Sneak King should be discussed in the same breath with Gears of War and Oblivion in 2006, you'd have some questions. I mean, clearly Big Bumpin' was the better game anyway. But for reasons I'll get to in a minute, even though I've heard a lot about Spot Goes to Hollywood, I had never played it until this week. Does it live up to the hype as a follow-up to the fantastic Cool Spot? Or did they lose their way a bit with too many changes to the formula? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And here's my copy of Spot Goes to Hollywood for the Genesis. This copy's in decent shape, with some flaws immediately noticeable, but the inside is better than the outside. The outer cover has actually held up well, with no scratching, tearing, or gouging, and really the only issue being that the hang tab was removed at some point. However, the inner cover is a different story, and I don't really know what's going on here. There's some scratching to the right side, and if you look at the middle of both the front and the rear, there's a giant crease. It looks like that maybe this is a reassembled copy and that inner cover was removed, damaged, and then reinserted. Thankfully, it's not that noticeable, and like I said, the manual and cartridge have held up, as we'll see in a minute, so I'll probably leave this one alone, But if I happen to see a really nice copy in a shop or at a convention, I might replace it, as it's currently only going for about $35 or so. One other note about the packaging, you may notice that even though this was a pretty late release on the console, it's still in a clamshell rather than the more fragile cardboard box that Sega was pushing at the time, and that's pretty common for Acclaim releases specifically. But this is also probably part of why the game isn't worth more now, because the clamshell allowed these copies to hold up and not be destroyed over the years. At least that's my theory. As far as the front cover art goes, this isn't bad, but I've got to be honest, it's a bit plain. Spot was always presented as being very cartoon-like, which was one of the strengths of the previous game. But here the cartoonishness is turned up, and he looks like he would fit right in with any of the Looney Tunes, especially with the red curtain behind him as he's being thrust into the spotlight. I also like the logo at the top, with the spot goes to being understated at the top and then really allowing the Hollywood aspect to be able to stand out, which emphasizes how this game might be different than Cool Spot. As mentioned, Spot Goes to Hollywood also got a European release, and I've got mixed feelings about that cover, as it is both better and worse than the US version. As clean as the US cover art is, as mentioned, it's kind of boring, and I really prefer the Mad Magazine style behind the artwork on the European version, which uses the art to emphasize what's going on in the game, rather than just hint at it with the title. However, that logo is atrocious. I'm not sure what they were thinking there. The PAL version of the game is apparently PAL optimized. It's not just the NTSC version rebadged. So if you decide that you do like the European cover better, just keep that in mind if you decide to pick up a copy for yourself. Opening up the box, and the manual looks pretty minty, so that's nice. As you can tell by looking at the table of contents, there's no time wasted in explaining the game. And honestly, like Cool Spot was before it, Spot Goes to Hollywood is a relatively simple game. On the surface at least. More on that in a bit. But regardless, all you're really doing is shooting and jumping, so beyond giving some background to each of the game worlds that you're exploring, there's not really a ton here that needs to be discussed. This is definitely one of those games that you could probably get by without the manual, but I still appreciate the effort. Okay, that's the package. Let's go to Hollywood with Spot and see just what kind of trouble he's gotten himself into this time. Cool Spot was one of the games on the channel that I was eager to review because of how good I remembered the game being when I played it originally. And as evidenced by the fact that I gave it 4 stars, clearly I thought that it had held up. It was just an excellent platformer, smooth animation, great sound, levels that encouraged you to explore and not just try to go from point A to point B, and a seemingly perfect difficulty and length, much like the original Sonic the Hedgehog. It was just a well-crafted product, and due to doing the channel, I was able to review the Master System version also, which turned out to be an amazing port, and other than missing 2 levels, should probably be talked about in the same breath as Road Rash and Streets of Rage when it comes to fantastic Master System ports of great games. With both versions of Cool Spot really hitting it out of the park, there were some very real expectations I had around what might be delivered in a sequel, especially compared to any other game based around a corporate mascot. For instance, I certainly don't recall anyone clamoring for the sequel to Chester Cheetah Too Cool to Fool, but who knows, maybe that and Wild Wild Quest are some of those hidden gems I was referring to earlier. I guess I'll find out when I finally get to them on the schedule. Anyway, whenever there's a sequel to a well-regarded game, the developers tend to go in one of 2 ways. Either they basically try to release the same game again, but just with new content while trying to shine up any rough edges that may have been present in the first game, think of, say, Sonic to Sonic 2, or they try to go in a completely different direction to avoid being known as just re-releasing the same game again. Or I suppose there's also a third option where they just completely give up because they don't have the balls to release that highly anticipated follow-up in fear of fans not liking it, but it's probably not fair to call millionaires out like that, right, Gabe? Sorry, where was I? I was just remembering that we live in a world where we got a flawed but fun Duke Nukem Forever, but God forbid Half-Life 3 ever sees the light of day. Oh, right. Spot Goes to Hollywood. Well, one of the things that changed with Cool Spot versus Spot Goes to Hollywood was the developers. Cool Spot was handled internally by Virgin Games, with a team led by David Perry, pre-Shiny Entertainment and Earthworm Jim. With the Shiny Entertainment crew out of the building, Virgin had to switch to another development firm when it came to working on Spot Goes to Hollywood, so instead Eurocom was brought in to work on the game. With an almost completely new development staff except for notably Tommy Tallarico on sound, and I'll get more into that later, it made sense that for Spot Goes to Hollywood that the development team would take that goes in a different direction route, and in this case that can be taken somewhat literally, as you can tell by the video footage, which shows the game now being an isometric based platformer instead of a side-scrolling platformer. Anyone that's played an isometric-based game versus a 2D game will probably be thinking, uh-oh, when they hear that change was made. And for good reason, because isometric games are simply fundamentally different than 2D titles. They may not be as different as a 2D game going to a 3D game, but they are still pretty different. I like to refer to them as 2.5D titles because they're kind of in the middle and they still have certain two-dimension physics that they have to adhere to, but the game clearly is able to give that three-dimensional feel that a flat 2D game wouldn't have, for better or worse. And before I go any further, when I complain about isometric related things here, I'm specifically referring to how it was implemented within Spot Goes to Hollywood. One of my favorite games of all time that I've mentioned numerous times so far on the channel is Rock and Roll Racing, and it's decidedly an isometric title, so when it's done correctly, it can be a very fun gameplay element. However, that last part is key. It has to be done just right. Even though Spot Goes to Hollywood goes in a different direction with its engine, some of the core concepts from Cool Spot were brought over to the game. Clearly, you're still controlling Spot as he makes his way through a series of themed levels, and Spot still has the power of carbonation, as he is able to shoot fizz at enemies. And yes, I had to be very careful with that last voiceover line. Why is Spot going around shooting fizz at enemies? Well, apparently some of his other Spot friends have been captured in each of the levels, and he has to rescue a certain number of them at minimum to enable him to proceed to the next level, which is basically how the first game went. Explore the levels, find spots and other power-ups like extra lives, and try to defeat or avoid the various enemies and environmental hazards. And just like how Cool Spot in every level had one of 6 themes, Spot Goes to Hollywood also has levels that match a certain theme, with the game being split into 4 themed worlds of 3 or 4 levels each. This all worked really well for Cool Spot. Why wouldn't it work here, especially now with this cool pseudo 3D engine? Well, there's a few problems. The first I ran into early on when attempting to play the game in the normal difficulty mode. The first world of the game is the Pirate/Sea World, which sees you start out navigating your way across the deck of a pirate ship before entering its hold for the second level. With an ocean-themed world, it makes sense that one of the enemies might be a giant crustacean, right? Well, you run into one of those early on, and then go to shoot it, and shoot it, and shoot it again, and shoot it some more, and well, it turns out that either the enemies in the game are just incredibly tough by default, or fizz isn't a very effective weapon. Or possibly both. I mean, who am I to say? I've never tried to use soda as a weapon. The point is, in Cool Spot, while sometimes you would have to hit an enemy multiple times to destroy it, it never felt excessive. In Spot Goes to Hollywood, some enemies you'll have to hit seemingly 20 times to defeat them, which wouldn't be such a big deal except for the engine. You see, since now the game is isometric, you have to be lined up exactly in line with the enemy to hit them. But then this also means that you're in line for the enemy to hit you, and depending on which enemy you're up against, Spot probably can take a lot less hits than they can, especially if you're trying to play in normal instead of easy. And to be clear, easy mode isn't easy, it's just easier than normal. Along with having enemies that just seem tougher than they probably should be, frequently you'll end up with enemies that are also fast. And not just fast, but faster than you, even if you choose to run, which makes trying to take them out even more frustrating because while you're trying to get a good shot off and then reposition, they're just running through you. You kind of learn to try to position them so that they're barely on the screen, which tends to stop them from bull rushing you, but if they get close, you're going to take at least a few hits. It's just unavoidable due to their speed. To the developer's credit, once you defeat an enemy, they are gone for the level, even if you die and restart, which is nice as most platformers don't keep that sort of thing in memory, but I almost think that they had to do that because the game would just be unplayably tough otherwise. Another area in which the game is overly difficult is just the bare platforming aspect. If you've ever played an isometric title, you know that sometimes it's somewhat hard to line up where you are on the screen. If you need to jump on a platform that's directly ahead of you, you have to make sure that the platform is actually directly in front, and that you aren't accidentally lined up slightly to the left or to the right, and this can be even more difficult when the platforms aren't on the same vertical level. There were multiple times when I was playing a level in the spooky/haunted house world, and I would be walking right along and then fall into a pit because Spot wasn't lined up just right, and because it wasn't obvious, you would almost have to die at least once at that point to know how the pieces lined up. This gets even worse in the next world, where you find yourself in an underground temple that has all sorts of fire and lava hazards, which require incredibly precise jumps, and that the isometric viewing angle just makes almost impossible to judge without guessing. To add insult to injury, the game features no continues. Well, actually that's not entirely true, as there is a password setting that allows you to pick up on the level you left off at, and conveniently the game will auto-store the last password that you got. However, where the injury comes is that the password includes not just the level you were at, but also how many lives you had, which means that if you scrape through a level with only one life left, you're probably better off trying to redo the level again, or else when you do try to continue, you will only have that one life each time. In theory, I like the idea of keeping up with how many lives you had because there's also the possibility that you could gain more than the standard amount of lives that you start out with, but the reality is that the game is so difficult, once you get beyond the first few levels, you're probably just going to be scraping by. One last thing that I have to call out is how the game is organized. As mentioned, the game consists of 4 worlds, and each of those worlds consists of 3 levels each, except for the 4th, which has 4. So there's a grand total of 13 levels. This compares favorably with Cool Spot having only 11. The loose backstory to the game, which really isn't even explained anywhere, is that Spot somehow found himself inside of a movie projector, and that each world is for a different movie being shown on the projector. Maybe the projectionist at the theater was a slob and spilled his giant 54-ounce 7-Up, who knows? And to those of you in Europe, 54 ounces is about 1.6 liters, and I'm not exaggerating, that is how big a large drink is at movie theaters over here. Anyway, this basically works for the first 3 worlds, with the first world seemingly being the pirate movie, the second movie being some sort of haunted house horror film, and then the third clearly being inspired by Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, complete with a final minecart level where you know you're in for some crap because at the beginning of the level it simply says to survive rather than try to collect a certain amount of spots. But then the last world rolls around and it's clearly a sci-fi world, but rather than focus on one film, there's levels that seem to have multiple influences, with a Terminator level, a Star Wars Trench level, and then finally a Tron light bike level. The designers technically stick to having levels influenced by movies, but this last world just seems kind of thrown together, and my guess is that perhaps at one time there might have been plans for more levels, but they ended up just combining whatever they had completed, hence why it has 4 levels instead of 3. Having the mix of influences in the levels isn't the worst thing in the world, but it does make that final world feel not as cohesive as the others. And honestly, I think they should have scrapped the final light bike level entirely because it has the same problem that the earlier levels have where the enemies are faster than you, but now you also can't shoot.
From a graphics perspective, Spot Goes to Hollywood has a lot to live up to, with Cool Spot being known for having very colorful and interesting looking levels, and while also having top-notch character animation, not just for Spot, but for the various enemies. And I can definitely say that none of my issues with Spot Goes to Hollywood are graphics related. It doesn't necessarily look as good as you might think a game that came out 2.5 years later would look, and that also has 3 times as much ROM storage would look, but the graphics are still pretty nice, with character animation that wouldn't look out of place in something like Garfield Caught in the Act. And it's not just the enemies that are silky smooth. Spot itself appears to have been rendered via some sort of CAD application, and he looks great as well, although it is a little weird to see Spot in a rendered form while everything else is clearly hand-drawn. I'm willing to chalk that up to the storyline of Spot being sucked into the projector, though, as an explanation as to why he looks different from everything else. On the audio front, as mentioned, even though David Perry and co. didn't return for this game, we do have Tommy Tallarico on hand again for music and sound effects. And while of course Tommy has unfortunately been part of some, we'll say, controversial business dealings in recent years, that doesn't diminish his musical works back in the day, and Spot Goes to Hollywood is another solid effort on his part. However, I didn't come away as impressed here as what he did in Cool Spot, as the overall quality was clearly not as consistent in that game, with some of the levels sounding practically phoned in. Also, many of the sound effects were just brought over from Cool Spot, so I have to question how much effort was actually put into the soundtrack, just in general. But it doesn't sound bad, but it could have been better. Spot Goes to Hollywood is a game that I was really looking forward to playing and reviewing because of how great Cool Spot was, and I was also very curious as to how the isometric approach to the game was going to work. Unfortunately, as it turns out, at least in Genesis form, it's a bit disappointing. There clearly was a lot of hard work that went into this title, so I don't want to completely trash the game, but I'd be lying if I presented Spot Goes to Hollywood as anything but a frustrating effort. And it's too bad because I think there is a great idea here, and there are some really fun moments. For instance, I quite enjoyed the first temple level, as it's one of the few levels that I feel like really had an appropriate level of difficulty. As a result, I'm giving Spot Goes to Hollywood 2 stars. Anyone that's expecting Cool Spot 2 is going to be sorely disappointed, and I really can't recommend this one to anyone that's not a big fan of platformers. But if that's you, maybe take a look because the graphics are at least worth seeing.
And that's it for Spot Goes to Hollywood on the Genesis. Just as a general programming note, yes, there was technically supposed to be a 32X version of this game that got canceled somewhere before it got released. The prototype was found, and a few years back, someone made a limited run of physical copies of it, but I am not planning on picking that up for the channel. From the video I saw of the game running, it didn't seem to be a final version of the game, and what was present was pretty much the same as the Genesis version, so I can see why it didn't make it to stores. You know, I'm just not going to waste my time trying to track down something that they only made 35 copies of, so it's going to be expensive, and it's not even a finished product. However, what I will say is when it comes to 32-bit versions of Spot Goes to Hollywood, if the concept behind the game interests you, you might want to take a look at either the Saturn or PlayStation versions of the game, as while they're similar in theme, they're also very different than the Genesis version, and potentially a lot better game as a whole, at least based on what I saw. Next up on the channel, it's time to delve back into the American Laser Games catalog of Laserdisc-based light gun games for the Sega CD. So far on the channel, I've had 2 experiences with their games, specifically Crime Patrol in episode 69 and then Who Shot Johnny Rock in episode 169. While both games were severely limited by the capabilities of the Sega CD, I actually didn't hate Crime Patrol, and as mediocre as it is, I still kind of have a soft spot for it. While I don't have mad expectations for this next game, I'm still hoping that it comes off better than the simply awkward Who Shot Johnny Rock. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 268. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!